Okay, here's the list of representative heroes for today's lecture, and keep in mind the fact that there is not any real unanimity about exactly how to spell or pronounce many ancient Egyptian words and names, and that almost every historian has a different set of dates for the reigns of the pharaohs. Akhenaten was originally Amenhotep IV, but changed his name and residence as part of what some have called the first real reformation in religious history. This and his bizarre appearance in the art of the time have given him a celebrity that has made him one of the most well-known of ancient Egyptian rulers. His son Tutankhamun, or King Tut, however, who died before he was 20 and is historically insignificant, is one of the most well-known rulers, or at least has one of the most familiar names in the whole history of the world. His fame is entirely due to the discovery of his essentially unrobbed tomb full of artifacts, and we'll see many of the most important of these. Seti I is not as well known as some other pharaohs, but his temple at Abydos is one of the most impressive in Egypt, and his son, Ramses II, is one of the real megalomaniacs of history, and many of the most impressive Egyptian buildings have his name on them. Okay then, if you have your pith helmets and canteens ready, we'll get started. You're now in Abdelkurna, a village on the west side of the Nile at Thebes. The village is what you see above ground here, but below ground the area is honeycombed with the tombs of the New Kingdom nobility. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom were buried in tombs to the west of the cliffs in the background, but the nobility, the upper class, the rich and powerful, were buried on the east side of the cliffs near the river. We saw that in the Old Kingdom the finest art was not in the tombs of the pharaohs, the pyramids, but in the tombs of the nobility at Saqqara and elsewhere. There's hardly enough Middle Kingdom art for us to make a judgment about this sort of thing, but in the New Kingdom again, though there is some fine art certainly in the tombs of the pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings, most would agree that the best paintings and reliefs are here with the nobles, not over there with the pharaohs.
The wall decoration in the pharaonic tombs is at least typically more theological, more didactic rather than pictorial. Here's an example from the tomb of Thutmose III, and that's his sarcophagus in the foreground. The wall decoration consists primarily of very schematic images drawn from the Book of the Dead and similar sources. The tomb of Amenhotep II, which you see now, is similarly decorated. This kind of thing is in the category, we might say, of practical written information rather than art in the usual sense. This now is the tomb of a fellow named Mena, not in the Valley of the Kings, like the ones we just saw, but at Abdelkurna, where the tombs of the nobles are, and it is one of the most celebrated for its wall paintings. Here you can see part of the interior now, and one of the sections most often seen in art history texts is on the right there. This is a facsimile. It's difficult to take or find pictures of the wall itself, in part because the passage is apparently too narrow for a good photograph. The original wall is in very good shape, however.
Much of the subject matter in these tombs may remind you of what we saw in the Old Kingdom tombs of 1,000 years earlier. The deceased enjoying himself, the good things about life on earth. Hunting scenes like this are common. They always remind me a bit of illustrations in things like L.L. Bean catalogs, in which the people are out in the wilderness and look like they just stepped out of a Macy's window. No one ever looks dirty. It also makes me think of things like the Trécheurs of Jean-Duc de Berry, which we'll see if you stick with this long enough. This kind of subject matter is not going to be rare in the history of art. Hunting scenes like this often look more like family outings, as the ancient Egyptians represent them, or picnics, than real tests of masculinity. No Assyrian would have been caught dead hunting with his wife and children along, nor would he have allowed himself to be seen hunting sissy animals like deer and rabbits or fish, for heaven's sake. Assyrians only hunt lions and tigers and that sort of animal. Most Egyptian painting is not globally realistic. No one would certainly mistake this for a photograph, but the Egyptians are very good at the kind of line drawing that might have made them good illustrators in our day. The animals in pictures like this are often depicted very accurately, if not realistically, if that makes sense. What I mean is you get all the pictorial information you need to identify the animals, but you wouldn't mistake the picture for the animal itself. This picture from the tomb of a fellow named Userhet may not be as intrinsically beautiful as some, but it's very interesting because Userhet here is riding in a wheeled vehicle, which is the earliest such thing to show up in the entire surviving corpus of Egyptian art. The date for this is about 1400 BC, 1,000 years after the pyramids were built. But this elegant chariot's obviously not the first wheeled vehicle ever built. This is no Model T chariot. And as I've said, I think the Egyptians, in fact, probably had the wheel much earlier than some think. We have pictures of wheels being used in Mesopotamia over 1,000 years before this picture was painted. This is also probably the first picture of a domestic horse, but there are written references to horses being used that predate this by some centuries. The first written mention of the wheel in Egypt also comes from the same date, around 1550 or so BC, in a description of the participation of chariots in a battle. This picture is from the tomb of a fellow named Nebamen. It's now in the British Museum, the picture that is. The Egyptian women who appear in works of art like these in the tombs we're seeing are, certainly by the standards of our day, stunning. The ladies at this soiree could probably get a job with any fashion agency. Slim, graceful figures, large, at least potentially expressive eyes. It is a little disappointing that there is so little emotional expression in Egyptian art, but there's not much expression in 5th century Greek art, or 5th century BC Greek art, or 15th century Italian art either. So this lack of emotion can hardly be considered a flaw, I guess. Here's another part of the party. One thing that might put people at Vogue or Harper's Bazaar off, however, is what they are wearing on their hair or wigs. That cone-shaped lump is perfumed hippopotamus lard, which gradually melted and ran down over their hair, keeping it shiny and smelling nice. This also made for good posture. The worst thing you could do at a party was bend your neck and let your hippo fat fall in your neighbor's martini. This is another picture from that tomb. The Egyptians were obviously great lovers of music, if you can judge from how often musicians are depicted in their art. And here's a group of dancers accompanied by a girl playing a double pipe of some kind, probably related to what the Greeks called an aulos. That's just a kind of all-purpose term applied to just about any kind of woodwind instrument. Usually, though, it apparently referred to a member of the oboe family, probably a double reed instrument, and they were played in pairs very often. One of the pipes to carry the melody, the other played as a sort of drone. And you can hear one being played in the background in this piece. As a work of Egyptian painting, this is almost unique in depicting human beings facing front. In paintings, the Romans are really the first people we can make eye contact with consistently. Here on the wall of the tomb of a fellow named Nacht are some more musicians I'd certainly like to hear play. I'd trade in the whole San Francisco Symphony for this trio.
This is the tomb of Ramos, the Vizier, the Prime Minister, as we might call him, of Amenhotep III. And here inside you can see him with his wife, who was likely also his niece. He holds the Sekhem staff, the symbol of the power of his office.
There's a tendency in Egyptian art, certainly, to make everyone look related to everyone else. There's a kind of ideal look toward which the appearance of every face and body gravitates, but that's hardly unique to Egyptian art. It's often hard for me to tell one actor or actress in movies made in the 40s from all the others. The fashion of an age makes people look alike, I think.
Imagine all those Romans wearing identical togas.
Or all the men at a corporate board meeting today wearing dark suits. Here in the same tomb is Ramos's brother with his wife, again with her arm around him in the protective sort of way we've seen before. Egyptians are almost always depicted in funerary art as though they died in the prime of life, about 25 or so. Many did die at that age, of course, but I don't think that has anything to do with the way they're depicted. They certainly never look dead. If you were an Egyptian, you got to look as good as you could look in the immortal art in your tomb. This is not an uncommon way to represent the dead in later Euro-Mediterranean art either, of course, but the Egyptians were at least as devoted to looking good dead as any other people in history. Now this is Pharaoh Akhenaten, and this serves to show in part that not everyone was as handsome as Ramos and his family. Akhenaten was born Amenhotep IV, the son of Amenhotep III, the builder of a large part of the temple of Amen at Luxor, which we saw last week, and the pharaoh for whom Ramos and his brother worked as administrators. Akhenaten may have been strange looking, but some images of him make him seem hardly human. We'll hear more about this sort of thing in a minute. But in the 5th year of his reign, he did something truly memorable. He changed his name from Amenhotep, which means something like, all hail the great god Amen, to Akhenaten, which means something like, things go better with Aton. And in honor of his new god Aton, the sun, whom he called, at least on occasion, the only god, he moved out of Thebes, halfway back toward the delta to a place he called Akhetaten, or Sun City, and which goes by the modern name of Tel El Amarna. His combination residence and temple complex, his Vatican City, stretched from the Nile toward those hills, and it was a pretty good-sized city to have been occupied for really just a very short time. This must have dumbfounded many Egyptians, this decision of Akhenaten's to move and to change his name. What would we think if one day the Pope just announced, I'm changing my name to Baba Hussein, starting a new religion and moving to an oasis in the desert? We'd probably just think His Holiness had lost his mind and hope for an early recovery, and that's probably the way most Egyptians regarded Akhenaten's aberration. How much his reforms really affected the everyday religious life of Egypt, it's hard to know. The usual view is that he stopped giving the priesthood in Thebes, the priesthood of Amen, any government support, but he doesn't seem to have made any effort to actually try to stamp out the old ways, and most Egyptians in the street probably just went right on worshiping Amen along with their crocodile gods and hippopotamus gods and so on. The temple of Itan was open to the sky, which would have been very different, of course, in atmosphere, made it very different in atmosphere from the standard style temples in Thebes and Luxor. There already was a sort of sun god Ra, but he was not the sun itself, but rather in charge of the sun and moved it across the sky. Aton was identified by Akhenaten with the solar disk itself. There's an artistic style that's associated with the reign of Akhenaten called the Amarna Style, after the modern Arabic name for Akhetaten. It's usually said to be characterized by such things as greater realism and informality than we've seen in Egyptian art, but the thing that most clearly distinguishes the style is a distinctive distortion of the human body. The workmen in this relief could almost pass for aliens. They look sort of like giant insects. This looks more like exaggeration or caricature than realism. There is a certain informality about the technique. Intaglio is easier and lends itself to sketchier treatment than bas relief, but it's the look of the people that really catches the eye. Here you can see some fragments from the Palace at Amarna now in the Cairo Museum. They are rare examples of decoration from a secular setting. Not much of this kind of thing survives from ancient Egypt, but I don't really think this work is more realistic or that much more realistic or informal than what you can see decorating tombs or buildings before or after the Amarna period. Here you can see Akhenaten now with his family. This relief from Amarna now in Cairo is certainly informal in its treatment of Pharaoh and his family, and that's apparently his most famous wife, the famously beautiful Nefertiti at the right, although she certainly doesn't look as good here as she does in the Berlin bust we'll see in a few minutes. It amounts to being a sort of royal genre subject, essentially unknown before or after, for that matter, in Egyptian art. But if this is realism, Akhenaten and his family were a really strange-looking bunch. It's been suggested that he suffered from a pituitary problem called Froelich's disease, which apparently produces this sort of gangly-limbed, pot-bellied look, but not everyone in Egypt could have had this disease. Maybe Akhenaten did look something like this, and so it became the look to imitate. I don't know. In this relief, you can probably make out little anthropomorphic hands there you see at the ends of the rays extending down from the sun, giving the divinity certainly a benign and protective character. In this image, you can see this relief, you can see the royal family there basking again in the radiance of the Aton, the sun god, the soul god, as Akhenaten calls this divinity, at least in some contexts. It has been suggested that there just might be some connection between Akhenaten's sort of monotheism, if you want to call it that, and the monotheism of the Hebrews. As I mentioned earlier, I think the Hebrews, if you're trying to put Genesis now in some kind of historical context, could well have been in Egypt, could have arrived in Egypt by this time, but there's no evidence of any direct connection, certainly nothing we could document at all. What is probably the most famous work of Egyptian poetry surviving is attributed to Akhenaten, the so-called Hymn to the Sun, in which he says things like, apropos of Aton now, "Thou appearest beautifully on the horizon of heaven, thou living Aton, the beginning of life. When thou art risen on the horizon, thou hast filled every land with thy beauty. Thou art gracious, great, glistening, and high over every land. Thy rays encompass the lands to the limit of all that thou hast made." Michael Atherton has arranged the original hieroglyphic text in the way you're hearing in the background. It's interesting to hear the attempt made, at least, to sing or pronounce ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics now and then. In this view of another image of Akhenaten, he looks more impressive than in some of the other surviving portraits. If we're to consider them portraits, photographed from this angle, he makes an imposing appearance. After his death, everything went pretty much back to the way it had been. Akhenaten was abandoned, and the first individual, or first rebel as he's sometimes called, was not treated well by later chronicles, and he was left out of the Abydos king list also for his heretical and un-Pharaoh-like ways. He was probably originally buried in a kind of family tomb at Akhetaten, but then it's thought his body was later reburied in the Valley of the Kings. A mummy alleged to be his was found in a tomb near King Tut's by the American Theodore Davis, but there's controversy over whether or not this really is what Davis found, the mummy of Akhenaton.
Modern facial reconstruction based on the skull found indicates that whoever it belonged to at least didn't look like the ancient representations of Akhenaten.
The history of Egypt for a few years, at least after the death of Akhenaton, is very confusing.
There are two people in the royal family, however, who are very important in the history of Egyptian art and can't be passed over. Akhenaton's wife, Nefertiti, whom I've mentioned in passing, and Akhenaton's son by another wife, Tutankhamun, who married his half-sister Akhetaten, Akhenaton's daughter by Nefertiti. And he became pharaoh after the short reign of Akhenaton's brother Smenkhare and perhaps someone else. We'll hear more about Tut shortly. This unfinished bust was found in what is thought to have been a sculptor's workshop at Amarna.
It may be that the subject is Nefertiti. The suggestion is sometimes made that it's unfinished because everyone just left for Thebes when Akhenaton died and didn't bother with stuff like this. Maybe, but it's a pretty nice thing to have just been tossed aside. It does bear a close resemblance to the more famous bust also found at Amarna and also thought to represent Nefertiti in the Berlin Museum. This has to count as one of the real masterpieces of Egyptian art, and it's mostly because of the impressive appearance of this that Nefertiti has become such a celebrated personality, although very little is known about her. If this is Nefertiti, and there is even some doubt about that, she is much more beautiful in this image than in the reliefs we saw earlier, in which she appears with her husband, Pharaoh Akhenaton, with their children, adoring the sun. Here she is again in profile now. She might not look so good if we could see what might have been her whole pear-shaped body and anorexic limbs, but from shoulders up, she's beauty itself. This is the Valley of the Kings now, beyond the cliffs on the west side of the Nile at Thebes. And throughout the New Kingdom, from Thutmose I on, some 60 pharaohs were buried here in gigantic subterranean complexes, some of which extend 500 feet into the cliffs or the ground. Important discoveries have been made here as recently as 1988, when Kent Weeks discovered that there was much more to an already investigated tomb right beside the Visitor Center than had previously been thought. As early as 1900, though, most archaeologists, except Howard Carter, had come to the conclusion that everything worth finding had been found in the valley, but of course he proved them wrong when he found King Tut's tomb. Here you can see a closer view of the entrances to some of the tombs. Howard Carter, like so many people who made major contributions to archaeology in the 19th and early 20th centuries, was not by training a professional archaeologist. He went to Egypt at just 17, originally to make drawings and sketches for people like Flinders Petrie and then the Frenchman Gaston Maspero, and learned archaeology in a very on-site, hands-on way. It's significant that in Who's Who, he listed himself first as a painter and second as an archaeologist, and this was after his discovery of King Tut's tomb. After being given more and more authority by Maspero, however, his career suddenly seemed to be at an end when he was fired after an altercation with some French tourists in 1903. He then met the British nobleman Lord Carnarvon, however, who was in Egypt for his health. I don't think of Egypt as an especially unhealthy place today, but it is a little hard to believe that people once did go to Egypt to get healthy. Anyway, Carnarvon had the third driver's license ever issued in England, and rumor has it he'd run into the man with the second driver's license ever issued, and he suffered some lung damage in that. Here you see the house which Carter occupied at the entrance to the Valley of the Kings during his excavations. Carnarvon thought, or his doctors thought, that the drier, lighter air of Egypt would be good for him. He was also an antiquarian, and Carter persuaded him to finance a search for the tomb of King Tut, which, as I said, he almost alone believed was yet to be found in the valley. Finally, just as they were both about to give up after Carter had spent many years of hard work and Carnarvon had spent many millions of hard dollars, the tomb was found in 1922. Here you can see the entrance to it as it looks today. When Carter found it, there were seals on the door which led him to think it had never been robbed at all. And he cabled Carnarvon in London telling him he would wait for him to break it open. And 2 weeks later, Carnarvon arrived and they opened the entrance. And inside they found the most valuable single collection of Egyptian artifacts ever discovered, but in a state of disorder that made the tomb look more like a Salvation Army warehouse than an art gallery. Clearly the tomb had in fact been broken into and ransacked at some point, but for what and by whom, or even when, is still a mystery. In any case, the robbers left behind something like 1/4 of a ton of gold, not to mention hundreds of artifacts which they probably regarded as having too little resale value to be worth taking. The usual view is that the robbers were interrupted and the tomb resealed by authorities who thought Pharaoh could just clean up his own house in the next life, I guess.
This is an artist's representation of what the tomb was like when Carter entered it.
The smallest in the entire valley, about the same number of square feet here as in a small house. It's really hard to imagine how all the stuff in the Tut display in the Cairo Museum was crammed into it. The paintings on the wall depict Tut being, as it were, introduced to Osiris on the left, and as Osiris being ministered to by his step-grandfather Ai, the regent for him, and who is portrayed as a priest on the right here. The paintings on the wall to the left depict the baboon, which is said in the Book of What is in the Underworld to be associated with the opening of the gates to the next life. This head was the first thing Carter saw when he opened the tomb. It was lying on the floor just inside the entrance. This is certainly a portrait of Tut, whose head is depicted here as elongated in the style that was, as we've seen, popular in his day. He was only about 9 or 10 when he became pharaoh and died still in his teens. This ivory and ebony chair is in fact child size and may well have been used by him. The fact that a lot of the things in the collection were made for a child lends a certain charm to it all. There's little that's macho and posturing, little that recounts the slaughtering of enemies or even hunting. This chair has a figure on the back called the God of Eternity by Egyptologists. It's important to make the point, I think, that the extent to which the Egyptians worshipped in a way we would call religious all the various anthropomorphic concepts which are loosely called gods is, I think, not at all clear. This represents eternity. It's a little bit misleading to call the figure a picture of, in any sense, the God of eternity. It's like a hieroglyphic representing the concept. Many of the pieces of furniture in the tomb have been damaged in a peculiar and distinctive way. The papyrus and lotus symbols for Upper and Lower Egypt, which we saw in use as far back as Khafre's day, over 1,000 years earlier, have been ripped out of this chair below the seat. No one has come up with a good explanation for this kind of thing yet. It's not uncommon. It's a kind of vandalism that's found over and over again in the items found in the tomb. This is called the throne, and it is at least the most splendid chair in the collection. On the back we can see Tut with his half-sister wife, Akhenaten Amen as she was known after the return to Thebes. She was the daughter of Nefertiti, apparently, and above them you can see the symbol of their father's god, the Itan disc with its rays ending in little hands. Clearly, there wasn't an immediate suppression of respect for this god, even if there was a general return to the worship of Amen and the other gods, or his symbol would hardly have been allowed on the throne of the pharaoh. There are also prayers to Itan in the tombs of important people at least through the end of the 14th century. It's often pointed out by tour guides delighted by this sort of thing that Tut has two left hands. Various bizarre explanations have been given for this, but I think it was probably just a mistake. This is what's called the ecclesiastical throne for no good reason. Notice here that the damage to the symbols below the seat is incomplete, making it look just like the result of some accident. We're going to hear now one of the attempts made by the Australian paleomusicologist Michael Atherton to give us an idea about what Egyptian music sounded like for a while. You have been hearing some of his efforts behind my lecture as we've been going along here. There is, as I've said, no actual ancient Egyptian music, of course, surviving. The Egyptians had no system of musical notation, but there are plenty of pictures of instruments Atherton could use in his work of reconstruction. Most professional Egyptologists poo-poo this sort of thing, but what the heck? It's as close as we can ever get to hearing the sound of ancient Egypt, even if it might be a little like trying to rewrite Hamlet with no more to go on than a quill pen and a piece of paper. The instrument you're going to hear now is called a boat harp, and this is a picture of a similar one. This is a bed that was found in the tomb. This is an ostrich feather fan on which you can see Tut out hunting ostriches with his happy dog. Here are some actual 3,500-year-old ostrich feathers from the tomb. Several game boards and gambling devices were found. There's an inscription which doesn't tell you how to play the game, however. It just says something like, it's not whether you win or lose, but how you play that counts. One of the finest things in the tomb was this chest, made of wood, veneered with ivory and painted. And on it you can see Tut and Akhenaten Amen again. If Keats had seen this instead of his Grecian urn, I think we might have gotten an ode on an Egyptian chest. A thing of beauty is a joy forever, its loveliness increases. It will never pass into nothingness. That's a different poem, but that's okay. There's a kind of flowery, feminine sort of rococo quality about a lot of 18th century, I should say 18th dynasty Egyptian art that reminds me of 18th century France. This almost looks like something Watteau could have painted if he'd been an Egyptian. We'll be back to see more things in the collection of stuff from King Tut's tomb in a minute. Now, since Tut was buried in the smallest tomb in the entire Valley of the Kings, and since he was politically an insignificant pharaoh who died in his teens and yet was buried with 1/4 ton of gold or so, what must a truly important pharaoh with a big tomb have had? It seems like Thutmose III or Ramses II must have been buried in something like Fort Knox. Scholars still argue about whether Tut had more or less in his tomb than the average pharaoh, and this painting seems relevant to the argument because it shows some of the things which were buried with that fellow Ramos, the Vizier of Amenhotep III, whose tomb reliefs we saw earlier. The things depicted are very similar to those found in Tut's tomb, and it's been suggested that there was, at least for those in the highest socioeconomic subclass, a kind of funerary kit. Like you get your bed, you get your 4 chests, you get your chair, you get your ostrich feather fan, you get your game board, all for one low price. Okay, this is where we'll take the break. We'll be back to see more of the stuff from King Tut's tomb in the Cairo Museum.